race and what is racism? And I've yet to find very many people that know. As a matter of fact, at one time, I used to go around the world and I would give people $100, they'd tell me what racism was. And they do, invariably I couldn't find one person that could explain what racism was. Because they use the definitions that are being perpetuated by the dominant white society. But let's find out what racism and track it. Let's go back in history now. So if you go back in history, let's go back to about the 1450s as an instance. In about 1450, there was no such thing as a race. What they had in those days, they had tribes, they had religious groups, and they had nations. That was it. Those three things: tribes, nations, and religions. But there was no such thing as race. But about 1445 to 1450, at that particular time, a guy named Henry the Navigator went off the coast of Africa. And he picked up about 16 blacks and took them back to Portugal and to Italy. And he got back there, he gave them to the Catholic Church as a gift and suggested they could use them however they saw fit. And they used the Catholic Church. The reason they gave them to the Catholic Church, you see, was because prior to that time, the Catholic Church sort of had played the role of being an advocate and a consoler for people who were slaves. Because to be a slave in that time, you had, again, as I said, be persecuted for being either for indebtedness or for religious persecution or a victim of a war, prisoner of war. And so the Catholic Church was playing the role of being a great consoler, come in and comfort you. And so when Henry the Navigator gave those 16 blacks to the Catholic Church in about 1445, 1450, they kept them and used them. What we do, we use them as slaves, as servants in the Catholic Church. And they used them in that role from about 1445, 1450 up until about 1488. And in 1488, a guy named Pope Innocent, he says, we found out over this 40-something year period, having these blacks around, that's a good thing. And because we never had them before. As I said before, to be a slave, you had to be either indebted to someone or religiously being persecuted or a prisoner of war. But these were neither of those things, so they said, well, this is a good thing. And so at that point in time, they injected the word race into race popped up. Not necessarily at that point, but around that point. And by saying, okay, what we're going to do now is just use them in any capacity we could. And about 4 or 5 years later, Henry the Navigator, after Henry the Navigator gave all these things to the Catholic Church, Columbus sailed around the world in hopes of finding new land and valuables and golds, and matter of fact, even finding dope and sugar. And he ran into a continent over here called North American continent. He landed there, and they found out that it was pretty much uninhabited, except a few, about maybe 200,000 at max, Indians running around the land. And it was pretty much uninhabited. He went back to Europe, and so by the early 1500s, it was a major thing was going on across the world. Starting in Europe, they were suffering from famine, diseases, food shortages, and crime. And they needed to do something to resuscitate the entire European continent. And they were looking for a hope. So when Columbus came back and said, I found all this land, and it's uninhabited, that's when racism started, right there. It picked up, going all the way back to Henry the Navigator up to this point. Racism started at that point. How did it start? Because then they said, you know what? We need to go find and inhabit that land and try to use it as value. But how are we going to do it? People said, well, what Pope Innocent said back in 1487, let's use those people called blacks. Use them as a labor class. And we're going to change the whole concept of how to get wealth and power and save this continent. The entire European continent was going down the toilet. Is what we do then, we're combining things. Instead of being practicing mercantilism, as we've been doing up to this point in time, let's come up with a new concept. And where you can own and control, get the land, get the tools and the resources, and use somebody else's labor, and to enrich yourself, that becomes capitalism. And that's where some concept of capitalism started. But let's go back to the concept about race. So a race started. 9 European nations, Italy, France, Germany, the rest of them said they got into a race. So let's try to see who can be the first one to get over in those countries to North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and use black labor to enrich ourselves. They were in a race to develop wealth and power by going and extracting the resources out of America or owning and controlling the land and the tools and using black labor to enrich themselves. That's where race came. That was a race. A race is a contest. They began to compete. That's why you heard me say on a number of occasions before, learning how to compete. And as they began to compete as nations, they competed from about the early 1500s all the way up until about 1857, right on the eve of the Civil War. And that's when the race ended. The race ended. That was a 300-year. The race ended then. You know why it ended? Because at that point in time, those European nations who had all pitched in together, as well as some Asian nations and Latin America, they had pitched in together to exploit black labor. And all the resources had been transferred into the hands of non-blacks. And the race was over in 1859. And when the race ended, they took the E off of race and stuck a suffix called ISM, which means sustain and hold on to the prevailing conditions. At that particular time in 1859, whites owned almost 99% of everything in America, and black slaves owned practically nothing. You had about almost 4.5 to 5 million slaves, but they owned practically nothing. And the only people, and the few blacks that had gotten something, was you had about 200-some thousand blacks that were free. Collectively, they had 1/2 or 1% of anything of value. At that point in 1859, the race ended. And they took the E off of race and stuck the suffix ISM. That's where racism came from. It had nothing to do with minorities and poor folk and people of color. It had to do strictly with black people and whites, which means all the wealth and resources and land, ownership, rights, privileges, businesses, income, and all been transferred into the hands of the dominant white society. And consequently, from that point on, whites would own and control everything in the country, and that was what racism was. At any time black folk asked for anything, for reparations, or affirmative action, or any preferential treatment, or anything, you sort of be in an opposition to it. Whites and their sub-ethnics would oppose anything that would allow the conditions of black folk to change. Whites were in 1859 on the eve of the Civil War. Whites in America, they were 100-foot giants, and black folk were 1-foot midgets. Make sure they owned and controlled nothing, had no power and resources. And that's where racism came from. It's remained unchanged until up until this time. But what's happening now, to keep black folk confused, they want to pretend that racism also is the same as bias, bigotry, hatred, personal attitudes, or discrimination. Those things have nothing to do with everybody discriminates. Even in a family, you can discriminate, you can have 5 kids and discriminate between them. That has nothing to do with racism. And see, black folk must learn that and understand that black people can never be racist. All they can do in America is react to white racism. Blacks don't have the power to enslave, segregate, or mistreat anybody in America. Racism is an issue between blacks and whites. It has nothing to do with language groups or culture groups or other groups coming to America. It is gays or midgets. It has to do with black people, blacks and whites. And so now that you understand racism, be on the guard. Don't let anybody use those terms in front of you to confuse it and mix it with things that don't pertain to black folk. White folks started misusing the word race after 1859 and told black folk it has to do with how you feel about somebody, and how whether you like them or not. Racism started off as an economic issue between blacks and whites. It is still an economic issue between blacks and whites. Now that you know, go forward.
I want you to hear me and hear me good. Because I'm going to pause. And I'm going to alarm you with what I'm about to say. But I want you to listen. Racism doesn't exist.
Ready for this? It's a doozy.
I'm ready.
It's 2018 in America. Does racism exist?
Absolutely not. And
My life was saved by a white man. I don't know what racism is.
And see, black folk must learn that and understand that black people can never be racist. All they can do in America is react to white racism. Blacks don't have the power to enslave, Jim Crow, segregate, or mistreat anybody in America. And racism is an issue between blacks and whites. It has nothing to do with language groups or culture groups or other groups coming to America. It is gays or midget. It has to do with black people, blacks and whites. And so now that you understand racism, be on the guard. Don't let anybody use those terms in front of you to confuse it and mix it with things that don't pertain to black folk. White folks started misusing the word race after 1959 and told black folk it has to do with how you feel about somebody, and how you, whether you like them or not. Racism started off as an economic issue between blacks and whites. It is still an economic issue between blacks and whites. Now that you know, go forward, produce wealth and power for our people.